Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, November 22nd. It's titled Your Collection, Deaccessioning Strategies. And this is going to be a live online presentation with Spencer Stewart. And we're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We have quite a few people registered for this event, so we'll give them time to enter from the waiting room. So just sit back, be patient, relax, and we will be getting started shortly. Thanks. Good evening again. If you've just joined us and you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program titled Your Collection, Deaccessioning Strategies, you're in the right place. So just sit back, relax, be patient for a moment or so. We will be getting started in about a minute, maybe 2 minutes as we let folks in from the waiting room. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. It's about 2 minutes past the top of the hour. We have folks coming in from the waiting room still, so we're going to wait just a little bit more before we get started. If you're here for the Book Club of California's live online presentation for Monday, November 22nd, you are definitely in the right place. So now's the time to sit back, relax, and get ready for a great talk. We'll be back shortly. Thanks. Okay, I'm back, and I think we're going to get started. It is a couple minutes past the top of the hour, and we don't want to keep you waiting for too long. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Your Collection, Deaccessioning Strategies, a live online presentation by writer, lecturer, and collections advisor, Spencer W. Stewart. This presentation is part of our series of talks for book collectors. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 160 people registered for this presentation, so for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. And we simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program. This is a presentation, as I said, that is part of our series of talks for book collectors. And our presenter is Spencer W. Stewart, and the presentation is titled Your Collection, Deaccessioning Strategies. Spencer W. Stewart provides advisory services to private collectors as well as institutions, aiding in the design and execution of collection development, management, and deaccessioning strategies, tonight's topic. In concert with his advising, Spencer is an active writer and lecturer on histories of the printed word for a variety of publications, including The Book Collector, manuscripts, Amphora, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Now, tonight, he will be talking about late-stage collecting and strategies for considering what's next for a collection. Collectors are the custodians of the materials that they own, and at some point, those materials will leave the hands of the collector. So Spencer is going to explore the options available when one is ready to consider what happens next and what one must do to prepare for that process. Now, if you have any questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A and the chat. And now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Spencer Stewart and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Spencer, it's all yours.
Great, Kevin. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming in today and tuning in for this conversation. As Kevin mentioned from the beginning, this process is really focused on discussions of collection legacy and thinking about the future of one's collection. And part of what I do when working with people about thinking about this process is to try and, through this process, decouple the collector from the collection in sort of in a thought experiment way to approach what are some of the viable possible ways of moving forward. And through this talk today, and indeed in this process, there's sort of two kind of diagrams that you want to think about as you're working through this process. The first is the collector and the collection, and both can be, the collection can be in some sense ready or not ready for thinking about the future. And then similarly, the collector can also be in a similar situation where they're ready for the process or they're not ready for it. And in this constellation, in this process, you're also thinking about what are some of the channels or ways in which the collection can be disseminated. So you're thinking about the trade, you're thinking about dealers, you're thinking about the auction houses, and then you're thinking about possible legacy processes as well. So that would be, either through institutions or inheritance. And so this is something that I'd invite you to sort of keep in mind as we're going through these conversations. But in terms of this discussion of ready, this idea, it's something that when I'm working with people, they, will be going through this process of thinking about, the intent of the collection moving forward. And it's often a phrase, I feel ready, or I'm not ready, or whatever it might be. But what that is quite complex, because collections and the process of building a collection is extremely personal. And it's something that is tied up with the history and story of one's life. So for a collection, preparedness is around bridging that gap between one's impression of the collection and the contents of it, the real items that make up one's collection. So having some sort of catalog or taking stock of what your collection is made up of in a really a very strong way, considering the conditions and things of this nature. And then for a collector, this is thinking about the intent of the act of your collecting, what it meant to you in the process and where you're thinking you would like it to go, these items and the collection that it makes up. Is this something that you think is of importance within an institutional context? Or is it something that you think through the trade can generate certain resources that can be passed on to others? There's a whole different, there are various ways and various approaches. but determining the intent or the various, processes of deaccessioning your collection, that all takes time. So understanding what the time, how much time you have, what's the timeline there, and how many options are provided given that timeline. So, in a sense, it's also really it's a shift of one's perspective in relation to the collection. I said it from the outset, it's this decoupling, but it's, what it is it's this alteration of looking down and into the collection and raising one's head up and looking out and around, understanding that one's collection is in and around an ecosystem of not only a collecting community, but also a market, as well as institutional interests. And these are all have different dynamics to them. So understanding that it is within a system is an important first step when one is working to understand what are the options for one's collection moving forward. And at this point too, it starts to make you think about what are the models of redistribution, what are the different channels through which you can move your collection into a different future, into the orbit with different objects and different other collections, be they institutional or through into other private collections by way of dealer or auction house. And this is a shift that, this shift from looking into one's collection and the act of collecting and situating it within a larger process is one that, without preparation of cataloging of your collection or an understanding of the contents and how it relates to this ecosystem, but also your intent and what are some of the thoughts that you have about developing a legacy. If these aren't things that are kind of considered before looking out into the expanse, is that these could be really daunting and quite overwhelming. So it is important to kind of think in these ways, because at this point in time, without these preparations made, the collection, without some sort of cataloging or description of intent, it doesn't really have a voice as to what are some of the intents moving forward for the collection. And it also sort of mitigates this discussion that I've had with a client who used the term emotional blowback, which I thought was kind of extreme, but in a way, it's sincere about the feeling that people have about their collections, and that commingling that happens between one's personal story, history, and interest with a given topic or period of time, and those objects that allow one to explore those ideas and access that period of time. So this discussion of voice of a collection, how does a collection speak? If we think about it, I have some distinctions here that, and these can be, we can explore these later in conversation, certainly through the case studies that I'll provide. I think they'll become a little bit clearer. But I often think of it across bookends of relatable on one end and eclectic on another. And for those who were able to attend the discussion on collecting practices and approaches, okay, we'll start with relatable. Relatable is more of a kind of object-oriented collecting practice. It's one in which there's an established collecting community around items that are in your collection. And so in that sense, you're collecting, the act of collecting and the collection itself is very much embedded in certain practices and understandings of those items. And so in that sense, in terms of assessing timelines for the deaccessioning of one's collection are considerably less because of the relatability to other items and possibly already pre-established markets within rare books, paper, print, or photography. And so in that sense, the objects are very much self-reliant. They have multiples, they have interconnectedness to auction performances and comparables in that sense, as well as trade offerings. And so in that way are connected within a network. Now, when we move to on the other spectrum, the sort of eclectic collection, This is connected more with the distinction that I've outlined of idea collecting that's based on a question, a sort of absence within a history, something where you're sort of trying to piece together a story that you feel is underrepresented within the public consciousness and understanding. And so in that sense, is a very unique and individual perspective. And it's something that collects outside of pre-established market understandings. And in that sense, in terms of developing legacy and thinking about possible placement in institutions or even in the trade, it requires more time. It requires more discussion about the collection itself. And because it's an internalized structure, it's based on sort of very personal approaches to a history. It's quite hermetic. And so in that sense, the individual objects together define themselves to make a statement. The collection itself, in some ways, is a unified object. And so that therefore requires a kind of a cohesiveness and a connected quality to the collection if thinking about moving forward. So one piece is in some sense a kind of brick that makes up a larger structure of the collection itself. But from discussing this, from looking at one's collection and thinking about, what is it along this line of relatable and eclectic, it starts to have you think about really quite concrete physical understandings of the channels of distribution for the collection. So is it something that it speaks very specifically to local interest of the area in which you inhabit, or possibly a place that you have interest that might not be where you reside? Or is it something of a national context? Is it a figure that's recognized within a larger region? Or is it something that's international? Is it something that's established through bibliographies and other things? Is it within a print run, say, of an artist, a modern artist who's well established and represented within institutions? These sorts of questions also start to open up what are the viable options one has for moving forward in a very real way, and also dictates the timing, right? If it's something that is very local and specific, you're starting to have to look for a single person or an institution that deals in things of that similar mentality. Or is it something that's much more relatable, international? And in that sense, are you thinking, in a distant way of possibly having it in an auction, which then has lead time of its own, these sorts of things. But really, in thinking about this, it's very much as you start to look out beyond your collecting practice and how it connects within an ecosystem, it will start to present itself as to what are some of the options and what kind of time do you have to carry out some of these possible intents for the future of your collection. In some sense, it starts to really set up what is actually possible, and starts to think across a timeline of less time often being something connected with working with the trade or through auctions, and more time being connected with placing of collections within institutions, or indeed setting it up through inheritance or a gift to either a family member or a close friend or someone who shares a similar interest, or who develops an interest in the collection as you're working through this process of thinking about what is the story that your collection's trying to tell. And from that sense, also, what are some of the intents that you have for the collection? Is it something where you're looking to monetize the collection through its sale, or is it something that you think has a place within an institution? That also dictates the amount of time it will take in this process. But really, it's about starting with one's intent. What are some ideals or possible positive outcomes that you'd like to see? Then starting to look around and connecting those to what's the ecosystem for a similar sort of collection? What is that a viable option? And then from there, starting to think of, okay, what are some really concrete scenarios that could take place moving forward? And this is all to get a real sense of, once you get to that point of placing the collection in either through dealers, auction, or institutions and inheritance, that you felt that you've looked through the various options to reach a conclusion that was a viable option, not feeling that you're rushing through that process, which can, back to this kind of this comment, it can be quite an emotional situation if you feel that you're doing it under duress. So it is important to take time to see where your collection exists in a larger context. Now, what I'm going to do now is we'll step into some case studies that kind of touch on these discussions of the collector's relationship to collections, the intent of the collector's collection moving forward, and what were some of the options that made that viable or possibly not viable. So I'll start with an example here that, let's just see if this, there we go. So this was an early experience that I had when I was working specifically through the auction houses, that was an interesting one, and one that got me thinking very much about my private practice moving forward and how to try and mitigate something of a similar situation. And what it was is, it was someone who got in touch with the auction house, and they wanted to deaccession a high spot collection related to Aleister Crowley, who was a sort of 19th, 20th century occultist, connected very much with different kind of black magic processes and white magic processes through that period of time. And someone who, there is absolutely a collecting community through which this material would be of interest. One of the things is that there was almost immediately when we were seeing this collection, and again, working within an auction context, there was a very, very short timeline that was clearly communicated almost immediately by the collector. And in that sense, there was very little time for execution of even kind of getting a sense of getting this consigned and put into an auction. It was extremely sort of short period. And there was, even in the early conversations, because of this short timeline and the sort of pressure that was being applied, there was very much a gap between the collection itself and how the collection related to a larger market and a collecting community for this sort of material. There was a approach to the collecting where this was certainly something that was of personal interest to this collector, but there was also this understanding, and this is something to do with intent of collecting, that this was very much a kind of asset. It was something that would have a return to it. Now, the issue is that, of course, this stuff had appreciated to some extent over the time of the collection being developed. However, the high spot element of the collection, the one that was valuable if the intent was indeed to see it as an asset, had been acquired very recently and through retail. And so what this resulted in was very much a gap in what the estimates were that we could set up for this material if indeed we were going to consign it. And that ultimately led to sort of an unsatisfactory situation for this collector. Now, when we were visiting this material and having a look at it, it was spread out, and it was primary materials. There were books. There were all sorts of things connected to Crowley and people within his circle. It was an incredible sort of focus of this period of time and this kind of practice. If there had been time, and if the perception of the collection had been a little different, this could have been a very, very good collection for a possible institutional placement. But this simply just wasn't within the realm of possibility based on the external pressures that were being applied on the collector and the collection. Now, I have since seen some of these items being offered through the trade. So from what I understand, it seems as though the collection was probably sold through trade, and there was ultimately a concession made. But there was a feeling in the conversation that it was just, there was a separating that was taking place between the impression of the collection and the contents of it. and also the understanding of the collecting community around which this material could be possibly offered. Now, this is another example that if approaching a collection in some ways as an asset or something that has a return on one's investment, especially in kind of a book context, one of the things that was interesting to point out about Aleister Crowley in particular is that it's quite within that collecting community. It's fairly well known that one Jimmy Page of Led Zeppelin is a massive collector of high spot material, and highly competitive in this sense about it. And most of this material was acquired contemporaneously with his collecting practice as well. And so it was a sort of thought that, well, there are certainly collectors of this material, but of this level of quality, a kind of conditioned collector, there were very few, and one of which it was quite clear that he was competitive enough that he'd had developed quite a good collection over time. So, in terms of thinking about this idea of high spot collecting and collecting as an asset, if we're going to talk about this type of scenario, one of the important things is to start to look around at something that may not be already an established collecting community, and something that, one that you start early, that not thinking that you can return on it in 5 years, say. So this was an example of one in which there were, it was relatable to some extent within a collecting community, but it was one that was quite narrow. And in terms of time, it was extremely tight timeline, such that it looked as though trade may not be the only viable option for the intent that the collector required of the collection. So let's move on to another example. Some people may have attended other talks that I've given. This was a collection of a client that I work with presently. And this was a collection that started through an interest in books that were translated into film, and then through to the development of the process of making film. So through working scripts, storyboards, things of this nature, and on into kind of precursors of film, to develop a collection that the collector talks about as the kind of development of the cinematic imagination. And this is a collection that she's been developing over time, and is actually this latter part, which is presently being built, is also something that her kids are also starting to connect with too. And I like to think of it as a collection that really bridges that gap, bridges the kind of the generational gap. Now, something also about this collection is that the early part of it, the books into film part, started through her connecting with her dad, who also collected, and he collected first editions. And this was happening through the 1980s and into the 90s, that they were building these collections together. And then she started to set out on the cinema history and into this development of the cinematic imagination. Now, something that I haven't brought up before was that the transition from the books into film into the process of making cinema. So this shift where she starts to look into storyboards and scripts of this nature was helped considerably by the gifting of her father's first editions collection into her own collection. He'd sort of stepped back from the act of collecting, but he was still very enthusiastic that she was going on with her interests in collecting. And indeed, some of the books within his collection, of course, had been adapted to film. And so there was a nice kind of meshing that happened there, where it definitely enhanced her collection in that regard. And then there were other materials that she then deaccessioned to generate funds to start purchasing material that engaged in the process of making film, the kind of the manuscript, paper byproduct material that comes out of the act of making cinema. And then from there, she was starting to move into the development of buying, magic lanterns, flip books, peep shows, things of this nature about the cinematic imagination. And I like this as, this is a thought of the collection as a process, one that transitions from one generation to the other, It has a kind of relatability to it, where the father's collection was very, sought after and relatable, which allowed for her to generate funds to transfer over into her own interests. And she's arguably gone into kind of an idea-based collecting, which is a bit more eclectic. So there's this kind of interesting shift that happens. And also this kind of collecting as a kind of palimpsest, something that layers over top of itself, and something that is somewhat unusual and rare within this period of time, of a kind of transition over, the ability to use one collection to kind of help build another one. And something that was quite, it took time in that they spent time together building their own collections in parallel, and communicated the interest and value of those collections to one another. And then we're able to make this kind of transition into the 90s, into the 2000s, specifically kind of the 2000s, where she started to get more interested in the paper material, the storyboards and scripts of this nature. And so I've often liked to think of that one as, it took more time, and it was sort of a time that was unaware of itself in a way. It was through the relation of the collecting that it started to build. Now, you probably remember this discussion of an eclectic collection, and trying to understand this idea of it being kind of hermetic, or something that kind of turns in on itself. It doesn't really connect as much with perhaps something outside of it. Now, this is an example, a local example for myself, to do with Perry and the Posterman's collection, which is at Simon Fraser University. Now, this is one where the background in this, and this is one that I've discussed before in other presentations, the background is that this was a gentleman who was the poster guy for the 1970s through to the 2000s, putting up posters throughout Vancouver, and through that time collected the posters that were put up through the city. Now, in that sense, it was an eclectic collection, because it went all the way from concert posters, as you can see in the bottom right here, Devo posters, through to celebrations and Bloomsday, rock and roll concerts, readings by Kathy Acker, things of this nature, protest listings, classical music, you name it. I mean, it was the entire spectrum of cultural life that happened in Vancouver. And so in that sense was very kind of it was kind of turned in on itself and connected to the fact that it was from the vocation of Perry the Posterman. Now, in terms of thinking about placing this collection, there were really few options. If you think about it from an institutional perspective, it was very much local. It was something that had to do with Perry and his connection with the city of Vancouver. And so in that sense, and this was kind of the desire of it, it was very much taking the time to make sure that sort of gathered as many examples from his job as possible. Now, the other thing, what's interesting about this collection, though, is that at the same time, separately, these collections, if another route was taken of thinking of deaccessioning it through the trade, certain posters would have been of value because of their cultural importance, connecting to, say, a band and their kind of international interest. But this was something that was very subtle, and it was something that altogether made up the collection itself. And if it had started to separate itself, the internal cohesiveness of the collecting practice, this life of someone who gathered these posters, put them up, and really circulated information about the gatherings of cultural life in a city, that this would have started to undermine that collection. Now, ultimately, the collection was placed within the Simon Fraser University, and indeed, you can access some of the examples, and the collection continues to be digitized to this day. But is really an interesting example of something that is very specific to a locale, and is very much determined by its geographical possibilities moving forward. What were its options? That said, its options within an institutional context were very beneficial. And so this was something that was also, it took time not only to communicate this to an institution, but it took time to just gather this material. I mean, it's sort of a massive amount, 1978 through 2018. So, this is that sense of kind of working through something and doing it in kind of an unconscious way. This is something kind of connected to a job. So it's a very interesting example of an eclectic collection. And we'll conclude with a story, and this is another discussion that I've touched on before about the practice of collecting. But this was a couple that developed a collection. They were expats from Ireland, but they were in North America. They collected together over a period of about 30 years, high spot material connected to the Irish modern literature. So, they basically started to build the collection in the 70s and would trade in one, a lesser copy, and then they would supplement it with their professional income to start really kind of building it up to a high spot collection. Now, by the time I had gotten to this collection was helping with the process of consigning it, they were, when we talk about this discussion of being ready, the collection itself at the process, it was ready because actually they'd undergone considering the deaccessioning of their collection about 10 years earlier. And the collection was very much complete at that point in their sense. They'd felt that they'd kind of reached a conclusion with it. And however, they weren't ready. What started to happen was they started to realize that the family was also interested in the collection, interested in its history. And they, when you entered where the collection was in their house, to the left was the material that was really the first editions and things of this nature. And to the right were the paperbacks of all the writers that were represented in the collection on the left. This was a collection that was very much connected to the family, and they were encouraged to spend time with these books, to read the texts through the paperbacks, and then kind of connect with them as objects through their initial appearance. And so in terms of consigning this material, they took the time. They took some time to sort of think of what was the future for this collection. Was it something that would be possibly situated in an institution? They kind of continued that. They considered that option. This was one in which it was quite well represented within the various institutions that they considered. So this was something that they thought, okay, maybe we won't spend time with this. And what ultimately the conclusion they reached was that the best way to deaccession this, because the families, the kids were building their own families at this point in time, was to offer this collection through auction, and then the money could be made use to the various family members moving forward. And that's indeed what they did. And in that time, they were able to kind of wait it out, and certainly the market had continued to gain in interest and focus towards this material. And so this was a sense of, they started this process early. They started this conversation of inheritance and possible gifting early, because that's often a conversation that takes a longer amount of time in the whole process. That one's not one that takes place overnight. It's something that requires communicating the importance of that material and how it relates to one's collecting practice. And they went through the steps. They considered, they worked back in terms of the timeline of thinking of institutions. And ultimately they realized that, in terms of their own collecting, they'd reached a conclusion, and they were really starting to think of, how does this collection connect to the larger context of their family? And so, this is one that I've often liked to think of as, when we think about this, is the collection ready or the collector ready? An interesting instance in which the collection was ready. It was prepared in terms of it being cataloged. It certainly could have been offered through auction at that period of time, but they took the time to sort of connect with their family and think about what's the interest here. And from that, they were able to understand their the kids' relationship to that collection. And there was a certain amount of closure and conclusion to that relationship as well. Because, when you think about collections, and this is kind of an image to just sort of think about when one is stepping into these conversations of a collection's legacy and thinking about the future of one's collection is that, when you're in the process of collecting, you are certainly looking around to acquire material to connect it to your collection, but it's very much kind of introverted process in which you're looking down and in. And when you start to look up and around at how that collection connects with an ecosystem, but also how people in and around you have been also aware of you as a collector, as something that kind of defines you. It's something that's very much connected to your identity. The collection is a part of one's life. It's a process that you're doing over a period of time. And in that sense, it's also inherently connected to others, people around you. And to take that process and that time to think about how does this relate to my thoughts about legacy and where this could be of value and contribution moving forward. And so, these are options though that really they can't be explored. These ideas of timeline, intent of one's collection, the various channels of deaccessioning. These are conversations that can't really in earnest be carried out until once the collector starts to reconcile this gap of one's conception or impression of their collection and really what the reality is of the collection they have and how that connects to a larger ecosystem. And so from that sense, it's how to develop some sort of approach or perspective that is independent of one's self in the development of that collection. How can one step back and have sort of an analytic approach and an objective perspective of that collection being in the context of other items moving forward and other contexts, other stories. And so with that, I would open it up now to conversations and questions. And thank you very much for your time this evening. And if you have any other questions, please do feel free to get in touch with me directly, either by phone or by email. But for now, thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, Spencer, I'm back. I have 3 pages of notes, and I see some questions. I see some questions in the Q&A and some little stuff in the chat. And a couple of people have texted me as well. So I'm going to start by just inviting anybody who has questions or comments to go to the Q&A in the chat now. We're going to be able to get through a lot of these, I think, because we do have a good amount of time.
Right.
And I want to say thank you for this because I know that many collectors think about the future, right? Their future, the future of their collection, the collection that they've spent a lot of time and money to build. And I think the idea of being ready, as you mentioned, is complex. I know it's complex for me. It's super personal. It's going to be different for every collector that's out there. And I like how you framed it in terms of the history and story of one's life. This isn't a simple concept. I think a lot of people were hoping, oh, this is going to be simple. Like, just lay it out for us, like 1, 2, 3 in this talk today. I mean, it's not simple. And I think you've shown that it's clearly not simple, and some people might need help and a lot of time to kind of think this through. And it's an important process. And I think it is a process. So thanks for sharing that and opening my eyes, and I think other people's eyes as well, to like how this might go. I'm going to start with one of the first questions that came up in the Q&A, which is, can you explain high spot, what high spot collecting is? You mentioned that a few times for some of the examples you used. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about it.
High spots would be something within, an example would be, say, within the realm of modern first editions, a book that's very desirable and sought after, something, say, like A Great Gatsby, which has a huge amount of cultural reverberations. It's been, it's been personified in several films, this sort of thing. It has a huge kind of influence. It's something that's well known in that sense. And so within that, the high spot is something that has a great deal of basically a fine condition is in kind of the best possible condition that one could think of, in terms of, you know, the dust jacket being coupled with the right book itself, to not have many tears or discolorations, to have all the points of issue that are connected with it being a first edition, first issue. And so really it's the pinnacle of it's the best possible condition version of a book of that nature. So like, say, kind of even like Ulysses, for instance, the first edition of that one, in the best condition possible.
Got it.
Yeah.
How do you go about having these kinds of conversations with your clients? Like, where does that start? In terms of helping to identify or talking about what their, I think you call it intent, right? What's their intent? What positive outcomes are they looking for with the deaccession? What are their goals? Like, how do you start those conversations, and how do you lead a collector to some outcome?
Yeah, I start with asking the ideal, like what is the ideal outcome? And what happens often is that this is something that's happening obliquely in the background when one is carrying out the act of collecting. There's thinking about the future, actually, in some way, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if it went to, you know, I'm aware of this institution having a collection of this similar sort, but they don't seem to have this piece. You know, it's those little fragments that people start to think about, or you know, a niece or nephew that's starting to develop an interest in a similar type of author. You know, it's these kinds of fragments, trying to bring those all together. Oftentimes, you know, the deaccessioning of a collection is something, it doesn't happen all at once. You know, it's not something that can be handled in most cases as a cohesive whole. It's a couple of different processes at once. It might be engaging the trade for some portion of the collection and auctioning off another. And then there might be a local interest collection as well that could be connected to the historical society to which one in the area which one resides. And so, as you can imagine, this becomes like it's like a syncopated, it's like a polyrhythmic process in which those take different timelines to carry out and engage different relations at that time. So in asking about the ideal, I start to get a sense from that conversation of what's the impression one has of their collection, and what are the collections that one has, right? You start to see that, oh, there's actually, it's not just one. There are many different moving parts to this collection, and they concern different possible futures moving forward. So it's really kind of through that conversation that, yeah, you try and get to the most ideal outcome, but also in that sense, you're also then coupling that with the reality of, you know, what's the institutional interest at this time? What are some of the market interests? These sorts of things actually start to narrow down your options pretty fast. And so that process starts to get going.
Yeah. So you mentioned that part of the process is getting people to think analytically, right, about their collection, like think less emotionally about their collection. How big of a challenge have you found that to be with some of your collectors in terms of focusing them and getting them to, you know, some kind of outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really think of it as like as a challenge. It's one thing where it's so, I mean, it's heartening to me often, the connection of one being emotionally connected with the collection. And it often is connected with great collections. You know, it's something that they're really passionate about it and engaged with it. And then it's more of just like oftentimes that great passion also translates as it being a collection that can be relatable, and there's actually lots of viable options moving forward. It's just having to have that conversation. So, you know, it's not often a case of like a resistance, and then we're also dealing with a collection that doesn't have many options as to where it can go. You know, I think that those things kind of come together. And so that's where, yeah, I work with people to provide that kind of information and it does take time, like, put together a report, and then it might take a couple of months to review that and come to terms with that, connecting with the catalog of one's collection, and then have that conversation about, okay, I'm ready to move to the next step about it.
Yeah, I'm hearing it takes time. People, I think, need to know that it takes a lot of time. This doesn't happen kind of overnight. I mean, I guess if you did know exactly what your intent was and your goals, and you had a translatable or relatable collection that was in high demand, it could be relatively quick process to deaccession it. But I think in general, this is a lengthy process, and it takes a lot of mental energy and research. Do you actually help? This is a great question about explaining kind of the economics. If someone's intent or goal is money, right, cash, not less of a legacy, like leaving it to family or leaving it to an institution, but to maximize kind of the financial value of their collection. Do you work with folks to kind of explain the differences of going to auction, going to a reseller, the trades, that kind of stuff? And how does that work?
Yes, I do. And that's something that you're in that process of thinking about the collection's value. You're really looking at comparables. You're starting to look at the performance of similar materials, mostly at auction, but also through the trade over a period of time. And most collectors, because of them being embedded in collector communities, they spend time with catalogs and things of this nature. So and oftentimes it's just like a reaffirmation of some of the things that they've already have a hunch about, but we'll put together kind of a report to get a sense of, this is the overall interest or market value of material at this, at a poor condition, relatively good or fine condition, understanding that kind of spectrum within which one's item might be valued.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was kind of the follow-up to the question from David about kind of the economics of different ways to deaccession your collection. In terms of selling, was about the condition, right? How do you talk to people and explain back to that emotional aspect? People love their collection, and they think it's the best thing in the world, but the reality to market might not be the same perception of those items.
Yeah. And that's a process too. Like, in some ways, this is something that I engage with collectors who are still in the process of collecting. They may be kind of in the middle part of their collecting practice, and if they start to kind of change tact and think about a different legacy for their collecting, may start to be more cognizant of condition rather than less. There's different, at different periods of time, that can mean different things to a collector as well.
Mm-hmm. There is a question. I was just lost this other question. In terms of, so we're talking kind of proactively about deaccessioning your collection. Have you had to work with a collector who passes before they are able to kind of articulate their intent, and it's now a collection that's in the hands of an estate or the children, and they've decided that they want to liquidate the collection? Has that been something that has happened that you've worked on before?
Yeah. And there are a whole variety of different kind of results of that feeling.
Right.
But one of the things that is useful in the process is that through the cataloging and those conversations, oftentimes I'll encourage a conversation with the family. Sometimes, in some cases, I'm present for that, and others I'm not, to talk about the collection. And it's surprising sometimes how, what wasn't communicated through the act of the collecting, which starts to actually engage interest in the collection. Like, it starts to rekindle interest in it through having that conversation. Because the collector has some assumptions that the act of collecting was communicated to others when it may not have been, and that now it is. And now that there's a kind of connection with actually identifying the objects and what their significance is within a larger collecting process, it becomes something that's quite interesting to them. And that may, that may result in liquidating the collection at a later date, but it doesn't degrade this experience of actually communicating the collecting practice and the record of a catalog to be able to kind of look at it moving into the future. For instance, that expat Irish couple, they have a catalog of the library that they had, and they still have the paperbacks are still connected with one of the families, and the other families visited and are aware of it, and there's photo evidence of the books, and there's this kind of connection of it where it didn't make sense to keep those collections disparately connected to the different families, and they had little kids at the time, and it became kind of like a stressful thing to have the material around. And they just weren't engaging with it in the same way. But now that's an opportunity, that's an option to have that as a testament to the collecting practice moving forward. And it's also, in that particular case, it was a testament to a couple who collected. It's really interesting seeing, like, they had financial records of the various purchases they made. And you see at some points they were actually away from one another working on things, and they had correspondences back and forth about items and about like the collection. And you start to get a portrait of the two of them, the grandparents in this case, for the kids. I think it's kind of an ideal. It's kind of an amazing scenario.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's an example of what you said earlier, that a collection is, the history and story of one's life in a way, and that's a perfect example of that. There is a question in the chat about do you have any recommendations for cataloging someone's collection, databases? Do you have any?
Yeah, I would start with this kind of process. I would start through either, sometimes people talk about being more like before one starts to engage with the software or hardware. And I've touched on this before with the collecting talk as well. I would recommend starting with an Excel or kind of a data sheet of some sort, or even a kind of a Word document that's searchable, that is a searchable document, but that is stable and something you're very comfortable with, and something that you can save on the computer itself. There have been some situations that I've been warned about of certain softwares where they're in the updates, things are lost. And if you're building that process of cataloging the collection, which is really itself time consuming, that can be really demoralizing to lose that and then have to restart all over again. So I would recommend starting with a Word document or Excel sheet, and then looking into reader wherefore if it's book related, or there are a number of collections or collecting management softwares for private collectors for objects, Axial, a couple other ones that there are about 3 or 4 that are quite major right now that seem to be buying up all the other ones. And so that's kind of a process right now where there seems to be a transition. And so that's another, I think, case for doing it through your Excel sheet just for the moment, for the time being.
Now, I know you and I talked earlier, and I know you're working on some talks and presentations from the institution's perspective, right? Yep. For deaccessioning. There are a ton of questions. Yes. I wouldn't say a ton. There's many questions in the chat and Q&A about leaving your collection to an institution and some of the specifics of that. And I don't know if we're going to, if you have hard information on some of that stuff. Some of it's about tax implications and things like that. But there are some questions. I think everybody thinks I would love to leave my collection to an institution, right? So it's there for posterity and all that kind of stuff. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that, how that works, how complicated that might be,
Yeah.
and some of the kind of the intricacies of those agreements. For example, I noticed that there's a bunch of different terms that are used, like placed in an institution, or donated, the institution acquired it or purchased it.
Yeah.
And maybe you can talk a little bit about some of those distinctions so people can get an idea of what they might be in for if they're interested in pursuing leaving their collection or having their collection acquired by an institution.
Yeah, so this is for 2022. I'll be putting together, I have an article series that I'm putting together right now. I'm just about finished, and it'll have a couple presentation elements to it as well. And it speaks specifically to the institutional context, because I was noticing in my work with collectors who are placing materials or selling materials to institutions, just that there are different case studies in different scenarios. There's kind of a period of time where people are trying to hash out what the intentions are for the collection once they're placed in institutions, and what are the institutional pressures that are applied on librarians and archivists within the institutions that they operate. So that's something that I'll keep in touch with you about, and be able to publish those out. I'm going to be working with some case studies from institutional colleagues in the museum and library and archive sector, who have, and it's really about this process of taking in collections from private collectors, the process that's required once a collection is taken in by an institution, and then these discussions of deaccessioning collections or deaccessioning items from within an institutional context. And so I am seeing some of these collections these questions rolling in that are very specific to things, and I think be able to address some of those with the article. And also, of course, if anyone has any very specific questions to ask me, they can certainly send me an email as well, and I can talk to them specifically. But it is something that it requires kind of meeting halfway for both private collectors as well as institutions to understand that process. And it is one that is, there's the overall, it's an overall similar process to some extent, but there are very specific examples, very, very different contexts within which this takes place. So yeah, it'll be an interesting, I'm looking forward to presenting that and publishing those articles in 2022. So
yeah, so if you haven't had a chance, the participants that are still here, to kind of scan through the chat and some of the Q&A, there are some great examples in there. And as an executive director of an organization, I've worked on many gift agreements for different types of real property as donations to organizations, and there is no kind of standard for this. Every gift agreement is different. Oftentimes, I think, as Roger noted, it does come with a cash component to help maintain the real property that is donated. So if it's a collection and the institution is interested in the full collection, which I think is rare, they will probably want some portion of it. There will be a very detailed gift agreement on, what they will take, what they might need to catalog it and maintain it, because libraries and institutions have restrictions and limitations, right? They only have so much space, unless they're creating a whole new building or a whole new wing or a whole new room for your collection. It might be difficult for them to take the whole thing. There are tax implications for individuals who are leaving their collection to a nonprofit, to a charity. So that's, again, you'd have to talk to your tax advisor about the specifics of that. And there are restrictions on the organization on what they can and cannot do with that gift once they get it, how long they have to keep it. So you can have your tax deduction. All that kind of stuff is very specific.
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the reasons why there are going to be these case studies to touch on them as variations on a theme.
Yeah, to give some examples of how they work. But they are, just so people know, there are a lot of questions about how to do this and what happens, and from people at institutions, and I think from collectors who would like to leave something to an institution.
Mhm.
I think the message is sit back. We're going to come back to you with more information about this. Spencer's writing an essay on this, an article on this that we can share. But there are no kind of easy answers for some of these things.
Mhm. I think one of the major things, just from the outset, and this is what it, working with clients on that process of thinking about placing collections and working through that process once there's contact, is to understand the librarian or archivist's day to day and what their role is within an institution and who they are connecting to within those institutions. I think quite often there's a situation where a collector gets in touch with an institution with kind of a vague description of what their collection is, as opposed to perhaps engaging with the institution from inside by talking about what their holdings are. What are some of the items that complement the collection that they have?
Right.
How that connects to not only that, but what kind of special collections is this? What is its mandate? How does it connect to departments and their own research, faculty in those contexts? What is the system within which these institutions and those librarians and archivists operate? That is, I think, a really important thing to consider.
Yeah, it's in some ways building a relationship with them and really understanding their intents, right?
Yeah.
And their goals as much as what your intents and goals are. And as you say, it's a give and take in terms of the items in the collection or what they're going to do with the items in the collection, and whether it's a donation or a purchase or whatever that might be. It all depends on how you build that relationship and how you build that conversation with them and meet in the middle on the collection and everybody's goals.
Yeah, and there's a comment in the I just opened up the chat
Sure.
now, and there's a comment here of I believe most institutions want to see an inventory, and in brackets, not a generalization. In most instances, in the instances I've been involved, an inventory is expected and appreciated, right? It's not a matter of, they want to obviously see what's made up of the collection, but also that you have a sense of what the holdings are so that people can start to have those conversations in a more substantive way.
Yeah, you might start with a conversation with a librarian or archivist or a library director, but it will progress to an inventory, right? And the whole description of what is entailed and how many items and then size of items and all that kind of value of items potentially.
And that article is working on that kind of granular detail of the operational costs of a collection too. So that's been really interesting research.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's a big consideration from the institutional side. Even at the Book Club of California, when people want to donate parts of their collection, sometimes we have to say, well, first of all, that's not within our scope of what our collection is about, but we also don't have unlimited space to take, something like that. And then there may even be a cost to archiving it and cataloging it and all that, maintaining it kind of thing. Someone asks where your article or your research is going to appear. You might not know right now, but if you do, you can share. But I'm sure you're going to send it to me, and I can make sure I share it with the audience.
Yeah, I think it's basically it's going to be a white paper, and there are a couple of outlets that are possibly interested in running it, but I haven't had anything confirmed yet. But there is interest in it. But at any rate, it will be a research paper, a professional paper that will be published through myself. But it will be also featuring in a couple of outlets once those discussions are confirmed. So
great. So Piero, if you follow up with me, I'm happy to share it with you when I get it as well. So we're at a little past the top of the hour here. I think we've done most of the questions that are answerable at this time, except for the question about who made the bookshelves in your background.
Oh, these are all IKEA. Old
Really?
the old IKEA bookshelves. They changed some point in the 2000s. They weren't as they weren't as sturdy. Sorry to disappoint everyone.
But they don't exist anymore, right? They're out of stock of that item.
Yeah.
Well, great. We're past top of the hour. I think we've got most of the questions. I will share, as I usually do, all the questions and the comments with you after of tonight's talk. And if there's anything you want me to get back to someone about, if you want to reach out to someone directly, you're going to be more than welcome to do that. If a participant wants to reach Spencer directly, his phone number and his email are right there on the screen for you. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Spencer. This is great. Thanks everyone for attending this Book Club of California webinar tonight. We hope that you'll join us for our next program. Our next program actually is an in-person program. Believe it or not, we're bringing back some in-person programs as we kind of emerge from this pandemic. It's going to be at the American Bookbinders Museum in San Francisco on Saturday, December 11th at 1 p.m. The title of the program is Mallet Dean, a Printmaker and His Art, and it's a presentation by John Hawk. He's the lead librarian of Special Collections and University Archives at the University of San Francisco. Our next online presentation will be Monday, December 13th at 5 p.m. And that is titled Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, How Editors and Print Culture Transformed an Intellectual Tradition by Ahmed El-Shamsi. He's the author and associate professor of Islamic thought at the University of Chicago. You can register for those programs online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So again, Spencer, thank you. Thanks so much for coming. We're going to have you back again for another segment in our book collector series, I hope, soon. And thank you everyone for attending. Thanks for joining us. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourselves. Thank you.